Okay, well, let's talk a little bit about observational gait evaluations and what we need to think about. First and foremost, let me introduce you to a few concepts. We are, by our biological inheritance, runner, hunters, and gatherers. This started at least 100,000 years ago, perhaps 1.2 million years ago, where our biology was really programmed to be moving and running. And a good portion of what we're suffering nowadays in modern society, depression, hypokinesis, obesity, poor diets, have a lot to do with the fact we've stopped being good runners, hunters, and gatherers. So let's talk about running now. We have literally thousands and thousands of years of running. So running could be considered an innate skill, meaning that we had to do it to survive and got very good at it. We were either being chased by animals or we were chasing animals. There's been a lot of rekindling of interest in this recently as people take to the streets now in bare feet. And so we'll talk a little bit about that later. So I'm an identical twin. And this is my brother and I running in Sydney in a track meet, and our coach could not tell us apart at the table when he would sit there and talk to us about running, but he could see us a mile away in a race and know which one was which. So even identical twins have different running styles. So why do we have such a high injury rate in runners? Somewhere between 30 and 75% of runners sustain injury in any given year. This is a study by Taunton in 2001, way back, well over a decade. And when we look at the most common injuries, such as patellofemoral pain syndrome, IT band friction syndrome, plantar fasciitis, tibial stress, this is all really due to lack of accommodation for a skill that we should be very good at. There's a lot of talk now about shoes. There's a lot of talk about the way we train. It could be all of the above. But again, we have such a high injury rate. We do know it comes down to two things, either running mechanics error or training errors. So let's look at the individual facts influencing gait. What are they? Movement from other sports. If you've been trained as a power sport like football, you're probably going to have some issues trying to be an endurance runner. Learn technique. Again, if you've been taught one way and it's not the best way, and then you try to run, you're going to have some issues with repetitive motion injury. Body structure and shape, those that are heavier, those that have longer limbs, those that have poor alignment are more likely to be injured and more likely to have those factors influencing their gait. Previous injury, a lot of the times this will result in compensatory movements where the body does other things in order to make things happen, but over time will break down another area of the body in order to compensate for another area. So we look at the environment also influencing it, running surfaces, and as I mentioned before, running shoes. We also see a lot of issues centered around muscular and soft tissue weaknesses or restrictions, imbalances between the left and the right, the anterior and the posterior muscles, and restrictions that might be caused from overtraining or too much running. Neuromuscular coordination or facilitation. You know, we spend a lot of time on getting the hardware up, the muscles, the bones, and the joints, but we spend very little time reprogramming the brain once we've changed the hardware. And this is an exciting and very, very new area in training runners and teaching them through cueing and being more mindful of their running. So what is human locomotion? Well, we look at it in 3D. We look at the primary motions, and there are horizontal motions, vertical motions, and lateral motions. So when we're looking, say, at walking, we see that the center of mass, that would be where your belly button is sort of got a curve that goes up and then down. And it's kind of like a pendulum, a stick that moves from front to back along a pendulum-type motion, or inverted pendulum in this case. When we look at running, it does the opposite. It does a dip. It starts at a high point when the foot contacts, then dips down, and then comes back up. So it's kind of like a inverted pogo stick. So if you look at the diagram on the right, that delta L, that represents the change in vertical displacement of the center of mass. And what you see there when you initially strike the angle there is fairly significant, and then you come over the top, and when you're over the top of the leg, you've kind of lowered your center of mass, and then you spring up. This is called the mass leg spring, and it's very much related to storing energy. Almost up to a third of the energy is stored in the lower leg. That would be the triceps sori, the plantar fascia, and the gastrosoleus complex, including the Achilles. Those three structures store about a third of the kinetic energy that's required or is used for propulsion. So they're very important. Now, let's talk about how we analyze or at least capture gait. So that's the first thing we do. We have three phases: capture, analyze, and then we correct. So we need a treadmill, and the runner is facing the direction of the arrow. We need a camera from the side. That's very important because when we break gait up, we look at, we really use the side view to tell us where we are in the gait pattern. That would be an example of a side view. We then have a rear camera, which is about 7 or 8 feet at the rear with a wide-angle lens. That's to take pictures at the rear. We then take the front view. That's about 3 or 4 feet from the front, again with a wide angle, and we are able to capture all these simultaneously, lay them down on the computer, then review them, either separate views or all three at once. So once we've captured the gait, on the front end, we want to look at history and screening. So this is our process for gait capture. We look at their static screen and put them up on the table and do some measures, look at their history, their training history. Then we can go with a bilateral squat test where we have them stand and do a squat, and we're then going to ask them to do it on their right leg, a single squat test, and then a left single squat test. And what we're really looking for here is quad dominance. You'll see them lunge forward, bend forward, and it's a very standard screening test that gives us a good idea of where they are along the lines of quad dominance as opposed to using your hamstrings when they do a little squat. And what you're really simulating here is a running stride, a static sort of running stride, and it tells us a lot about their ability to maintain a single leg stance.
David, that one-legged squat test, is the trail leg up on something, or is the trail leg ahead of the...
Trail leg is ahead.
Okay.
It is ahead. Yeah, and you're simulating a running stride.
So they sometimes refer to that type of squat as a pistol squat. Is that...
Okay, that would be it. That would be a good name for it. I've not used that name, but I have heard it. A pistol squat. I like that. And so then we would evaluate them using the three cameras while walking, usually around speeds about 2.7 miles per hour to about 3.5 miles per hour, depending what they're comfortable with. And then we pick a running speed that they normally do. And that would be their normal training pace or their running economy pace, about 65 to 75% of their max. And we usually determine that from their 5K time and just extrapolate using VO2 regression. We then repeat the walking and the running at the same speeds in a minimalist flat if they're using, or a racing flat, and their training flat. So we try to look at three conditions across walking and running speeds that they would normally use. When we put them in a shoe, we may add a third sort of evaluation where we run them at high speed. We don't do this in bare feet because they're a little uncomfortable, but usually for conditions 6 and 7, the minimalist flat and the training flat, we'll have them actually run at a second speed, which is slightly higher velocity. It would be more representative of their 5K speed as opposed to their running economy speed. And then our capture times are usually 3 to 5 seconds, which will give us approximately 300 frames. Again, 60 frames a second. You don't need a lot of video to see 2 or 3 good gait cycles, and that's really all you need. So here's an example of the 3-camera view that the sports motion software provides us. And this is all caught simultaneously with one click of the button down here, this little camera. Up comes the screen, and it'll record my video. You know, if I didn't have 3 cameras, I could, and it also records actually the speed and the cadences. If I wanted to, I could type it into the screen. This would be a 2-screen capture, and this is really the way I look at it. And then finally, that would be a single capture where I could just use one camera and go around and look at each one individually. So these tools are very, very useful, and I could in fact show you that, but I'll keep moving on my presentation. So a second device that we use besides the cameras is a triaxial accelerometer. This one's made by Zephyr, and it's a very good tool because it integrates heart rate, respiration rate, skin temperature, as well as 3-dimensional changes in the center of mass of the body. And it allows me to get a good estimate of measuring how quickly the body's moving in these 3 planes, whether it's moving up or down, sideways left, sideways right, or forward or backwards. And so as you can see, it's a little strap here. It will transmit Bluetooth from this device straight into my computer in real time. So what sort of things do I look at here? Well, once I've collected video and accelerometry, I try to join the dots up. This is an example of the accelerometry that I use that would measure what we call peak acceleration. This would be each stop represents a step, and what I've done is I've measured walking and running across the 3 shoe conditions: bare feet, minimalist training flat would be TF1, and then their regular training flat would be TF2. And as you can see, in this case, the shoe condition is exerting more peak force, right, than the barefoot condition. As you can see, the blue line is lower, about 1.4 Gs. Now, these are peak accelerations, and I just use these to ferret out to see if the shoes, in fact, are protecting the foot or actually increasing the ground reaction forces, which some of the shoes do. The second graph that I take, this is a graph where I've taken an individual sample of 3 dimensions, and each one of these represent 3 dimensions. The vertical is red, the horizontal is blue, and the lateral is green. So if we look at the vertical, this allows me to measure each impact, foot impact. So if we look at red, right where it leaves 0 is where the heel strikes. And then when it reaches -2, that would be a deceleration now because it's a braking force. It then goes straight to a positive acceleration or a drive acceleration, and that would be right when we begin to go into the drive phase. So the downslope of the red, that would be braking, and the upslope of the red would be propulsion. This allows me to proportion out how much of the gait, how much of the stance phase is braking force, which we don't want a lot of, and how much time is spent propelling the body per gait cycle, per step. And as you can see, I can compare left and right. Let's say that first one's the right leg. You can see how it comes up the third little deflection. That would be both right legs. So 1 and 3 would be right, and then 2 and 4 would be left leg in this case. And you can see how each leg has their own signature, both in terms of vertical accelerations and horizontal and lateral accelerations. And when you have a very rapid acceleration, you typically have a rapid eccentric load on the muscles controlling that. So when we're looking at braking forces, you're seeing a lot of eccentric load on, let's say, the anterior muscles of the shin. as the foot comes down and loads, or on the hamstring, or the quads rather, as you bend the knee and absorb some of that shock with knee and hip flexion. So it really allows us to see in real numbers, in G-forces and accelerations, how well the lower extremity is accommodating to these forces. I am still working very diligently on matching up my video with these tracings, and I assure you I've learned a lot in the last year and a half that I've been looking at the accelerometry data. This would be, for instance, training flat, and we could actually compare. You can see there's a slightly more vertical force on the training flat than the bare feet. See, there's bare feet, finishes up at worst case scenario -2, whereas here you've got almost half a G change there. I'm sorry, a slight change in that. So this is very new. We're looking at this. The technology also allows me to measure how many steps per minute very precisely, just like an EKG. Every one of those little blips down represents a foot strike. So how do we analyze this? Well, we take the data. When we're looking at the gait cycle, we divide it up in the initial contact phase. That's where the heel hits the ground, right? So that would be 3 types of options there. Rear foot strike, that's when you're in the back 1/3. Midfoot strike, that's when you're in the mid 1/3 of the foot. And forefoot strike, that would be when you're in the front third of the foot. So that's initial contact. We won't call that heel strike. We call it initial contact. Then as we move through the I would say the contact phase of the gait cycle, we then go into mid stance, and that's when the 2 thighs are parallel. Down here, you can see the 2 thighs are parallel. That foot's at 90 degrees, which it should be. Many runners who run slow, you see that leg down low. We really want it at 90 degrees once you're running it, even if you're running economy space. So that's mid stance, and then the moment the heel comes off the ground, that's heel off, and then the moment the foot comes off, that would end the grounded phase of the gait cycle, or the contact phase of the gait cycle, as the foot leaves the ground. Phase 2, as I said, was mid-stance, and then phase 3 of the stance is heel off. So we really have 3 phases there. Initial contact, mid-stance when the thighs together, and then when the heel's off. Again, mid-stance, you begin to go into propulsion right after mid-stance. Then you should see the heel come off once you are in full propulsion. Phase 4, finally, that would be the toe off, where the foot's off on that right picture. So that's the stance phase. Next would be the swing phase, and that would be just looking at the other leg. That's when, in running, you have both feet off the ground. That's called double support. Double float. You always have you can always have one leg on the ground for walking, and then you have 2 on the ground. So walking's a little different. Running, you'll have 1 leg on the ground, and 2 off, then 1 on. And so we start with the initial swing or propulsion, and then we go to mid-swing, where the swing leg now is parallel, the 2 thighs are parallel. So that's really where swing and stance phase are exactly the same. So you can see the left leg there is parallel, and that would be what we call mid-swing for the left leg. It would be mid-support for the right leg. And now looking at terminal swing, that would be right when the leg flings out in front of the body and is getting ready to drop down. Just right before the contact phase. So that's really your 2 major components, swing and contact or support phase. Problem is, we spend a lot of time looking at this, but with rear foot strikers, as opposed to forefoot strikers, rear foot strikers tend to have this impact load, this impulse load, and it happens it's a little more prolonged, and it's this high impact. As you can see, the rear foot strike is about 1.5 times the body weight, whereas if you look at the forefoot striker, he's a little less than 1 in terms of the first 20% of the gait, the foot strike. This is a very important area because we think that back in 1970, when we started looking at force plate data like this, that we put, it was actually Peter Cavanaugh in 1972, he put everybody in these new Nike Cortezes that had these high heel lifts, and lo and behold, felt that everybody was a rear foot striker. Had he brought in barefoot runners who were trained, he probably would have found a lot more people striking mid-foot. So this is kind of where the shoe company started in 1980. 1970s, early 1970s, they started looking at protecting the heel when in fact they were exasperating the problem. And so the impact loading and stress fractures, what we've found out is this is impact loading and tibial shock, that would be shock going up the tibia, seems to be related to a history of stress fractures. And peak forces were not. So it's not just the amount of force, it's how rapid that force is applied in the initial part of the stance phase. And here you can see the differences between rear foot strikers, mid-foot strikers, and forefoot strikers. This is work done by Atman in 2009, and that perhaps we're suggesting now that mid-foot striking is more of a healthy compromise, and that in fact we need to start looking at shoes that allow us to do that, and maybe integrating some barefoot running into our training.
Do shoes right now currently support this?
I'm sorry? Do shoes, yes. They're beginning to see shoes that have a lot less drop, in other words, a lot less lift in the heel, whereas most of them are around 12 to 14 millimeters. We're beginning to see shoes now around the 6 to 8 millimeter down to negative. And that's being looked at right now. The shoe companies certainly, I wouldn't throw out all your shoes. I would consider mid-foot striking and forefoot striking in shoes that might allow you to accommodate that a little better, and use those shoes in settings where you're running faster or you're running, you're trying to change your gait. So that would be definitely something I would encourage. If in fact you are a mid-foot striker, that's probably the way we want people to run, because there's no impact. And if you want to go to Harvard, the Harvard Gait lab up there, and look, they have some beautiful slow motion videos showing this effect. A lot of this was looked at by Lieberman in Nature 2010 when he started to look at feet and said perhaps we want to Xanth line in our heels and experience impact peaks. And in fact, when you look at people, indigenous populations that have bare feet, they tend to have very little of the problems we have, like bunions and calluses and issues that tend to be related to shoes. And so this is a great statement that occurred that was in the the Journal of Clinical Orthopedics in 1972, and it says, all writers who have reported their observations of barefoot peoples agree that the untrammeled feet of the natural men are free from the disabilities commonly noted among shod people. These are common things: hallux valgus, bunions, hammer toe, and painful feet. All seem to be related to the fact that 10,000 years we started putting shoes on. And you can look at this now. This is 10,000 years ago, the first sandals. All right, and if you look at those, they were really only designed to protect us from hot or cold surfaces and abrasion, not really to control the foot. Looking at shoes now, the first running shoe was actually a spike shoe that had people running on their forefoot. Right, the next shoe, and this is the first sneaker, was made by kids in 1917. Again, a neutral shoe, and that's what they call running sneakers. Kids. Adidas, now Adidazzler, now Adidas, they introduced their custom shoes a long time ago. If you're looking at Aztecas, Asis, and Tiger, that was the first shoe company that Phil Knight looked at and began to import a shoe that was exactly the same as the Tiger shoe, but he called it the Nike Cortez. And that was the beginning of the modern running shoe. Nowadays, the modern running shoe is elevated cushions, stiff-heeled, arch support, high medial install and density. The problem with that is that it really creates an artificial environment for the foot, which I'll get back to in a minute. In terms of injury reduction and selecting the right shoe based on foot structure, it seems that the evidence is beginning to debunk that now. But assigning shoes based on the shape of the plantar foot surface has no influence on injuries. That in fact, the best way to pick a shoe is the shoe that's most comfortable. If it's not comfortable, it won't work. And this may also be true for orthotics. When you look at high shoes that have a high cushion, very, very high, you tend to see this impact force, this rear foot strike force that's not present in a forefoot runner in bare feet. They tend to have longer strides in shoes, and I've seen that in my lab. Just about everybody will take 5 or 6 strides per minute longer, at least that, some even more. So instead of pushing out 180, they're doing about 165. That has to be accomplished by a longer stride. Whereas barefoot runners that are midfoot strikers and forefoot strikers have a much shorter stride. The other side to this is if we have a very high lift in the shoe, we raise the center of mass of the ankle, providing more of a lever point for instability. And so the ground reaction forces, they tend to have longer lever arms and longer greater torque forces, particularly on the Achilles, where we see a lot of issues. These are the shoes that Ron Hill ran in 1970 and won the Boston Marathon in. And there was also Abib Kabir in the early 1900s who won the Olympic marathon in bare feet. Why don't shoes cushion our land? Well, there's 2 studies done, one by McNitt and Gray, and this is information I got from the Running Medicine Conference in Virginia in 2012. Stiff mat gives us soft landings. When they looked at gymnasts, stiff mat gives them soft landings, where soft mat gives them stiff landings. And then they looked at more cushioning the stiffer the knee, all right? And they also, what really is going on here is a thing called joint coupling. If you land on harder surfaces, your joints will accommodate so that you land softer. So when you land on a hard surface, right, your joints tend to accommodate a little bit. On a soft surface, they don't. So more cushioning, you kind of have a stiffer knee. And that was a study. What they did was they looked at shoes and the cost of shoes. They actually found out shoes that were high cost, like $65, were much more stiffer and much more likely to give you a hard landing. So what they did was they looked at a study. Marty and his colleagues in 1989, they looked at this study and they compared some shoes. They took runners who wore $95 shoes and they looked at runners who wore $40 shoes, and what they found was, even when corrected for previous injury and training mileage, such as you see above there, those that wore the shoes were twice as likely to get injured than those wearing the $40 shoes. So that's pretty interesting. So just because you spend a lot of money on shoes, it doesn't mean that they're going to work. Here's another study that Shinohara did in 2009. He looked at the effect of what we call static balance and trying to ferret out, is the foot a sensory organ? And in fact it is. When you look at, this is the total time that balance was maintained in seconds, you can see a significant difference in the barefoot compared to the sock that even has the toe digit thing going. And then compared to the sock with no digits, that was slightly about the same. So what I'm saying is that perhaps we need to start thinking about what's coming up the spinal cord from the foot and begin to re-educate runners through barefoot running and through static balance exercises that do not involve a shoe or a sock.
David, can I ask you a question in regards to barefoot running?
Yes.
You're seeing those 5-fingered Vibram types of products. Adidas has launched their own 5-fingered for their feet, where it's more representing the first image there of the person with independent digits available for use. Is that really barefoot running, or is that more barefoot than, and are there any benefits to that?
Well, I think it's kind of like a step in between, and it's what I would recommend. I think the most important part here is one is not better than the other, but more importantly, if you're going to introduce minimalist shoes or minimalist socks or bare feet, that it be titrated very slowly and integrated. So in other words, what I envision runners having 3 pairs of shoes or 2 pairs of shoes. Racing flats or minimalist shoes that are very light and very neutral in their in how much material, midsole material they have, and then training flats that they would use for low-speed running and high volume, right? And then bare feet, which they would use to enhance their running motor skills through drills and through at least once a week running on the grass and stimulating the brain, stimulating the software to find what I would call a primal biomechanical pattern that can only be reinvigorated through more sensory input coming up the leg vis-a-vis a barefoot.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Does that answer your question?
Oh yeah, that's very valuable information that you just shared. I hope everyone gets that on the podcast.
Okay, so again, we are all looking into this right now, and our interventions here include that. We titrate them in so that one day a week they're getting 30 minutes of barefoot running on a beautiful surface. It doesn't have to be soft, but it has to be forgiving in terms of friction and sharp objects. When we look at the advantages of reducing footwear, here's another study, a couple of them, one by Robbins and then one done by Bergman in 2005. He took 25 Nike Frees and 25 normals, and all they did was warm up. And 5 months later, tested their strength and balance and agility in a cross-section area of their muscle. And as you can see, the increases, there's the changes, right, in improved strength, particularly in the intrinsics and some of the extrinsic muscles. They improved in balance and agility tests. So raw strength as well as functional balance and agility improved just by putting them in a different shoe condition. Now that makes sense because the shoe can in fact be a problem with, and I think this next slide tells it all. Why do we treat the fit differently? That's the question. When we have somebody who has neck pain, do we leave them in the neck brace? Absolutely not. But when we have an orthotic, we tend to not only leave them in the orthotic, we tend to re-up that same orthotic after 3 years. So I think I have a problem with that. Anybody who gets an orthotic or gives an orthotic, they should be given in conjunction with very specific, very targeted exercises that would improve the infrastructure of the foot, not the external forces applied to it. So today, endurance running is primarily a form of exercise and recreation, but its roots may be in ancient and origin in the human genesis it's a major contributing factor for our human bodies, and in fact running provides most of the stimulus we need physically, and that in fact that was our primary task many thousands of years ago. So what do I look for? Low-hanging fruit. We're going to look at strike pattern when we look at video. Are they a rear foot striker, mid-foot striker, forefoot striker? Why is that important? Well, if you've got this shoe that's got all the gizmos in the rear foot and you're a forefoot striker, it's really wasted. Even though you come back on that foot, it's not going to be as effective. And that, in fact, maybe we need to start looking at posting in forefoots and midfoot strikers and how we design shoes specifically for them. Stride frequency and stride length are very much related. So if your stride frequency is 165, you're probably overstriding. If it's 175 to 185, you're probably doing okay. Also, the width of stride. If it's narrow, we see a lot of that crossover, then you're going to probably have IT band problems, glute problems, because you're straining all the muscles that are involved in keeping you out or externally rotating you. That would be the glutes, hamstrings. And in effect, if you have a narrow gait or a wide gait, those two things can cause other issues. Trunk range of motion stability, we look at that. Are you moving correctly? Are you stable? Do you have a stable core that you can drive from in the drive phase of running? Supination, pronation are very, very common things we look at. If you're a supinator and if you hit in a very supinated position and then continue to pronate, you're going to be a lot worse off because your joint excursion is going to be much greater, and you're actually going to generate a lot more velocity and therefore generate a lot more eccentric load on your joints. So joint excursion, how much range you go through there, generally speaking, supination about 5 degrees at heel strike, or foot strike, sorry. And then as you go into the mid-stance phase, you wouldn't want to see pronation going any further than 12 degrees. So 5 to 12 degrees on pronation is good. About 5 degrees angle of supination at strike is okay as well. Timing, if you tend to go past mid-stance and still continue to pronate, and the lower leg, and then the upper leg, the thigh is externally rotating. With pronation, we have the lower leg internally rotating. If the thigh is externally rotating right after mid-stance, then you're going to get what we call tibial torsion. Thigh's going one way, externally rotated. The tibia is going the other way, and that's how you're going to get patellofemoral pain. Hip and knee and ankle motion, in 3 planes, we're looking at that. How much joint excursion do we have in hip, knee, and ankle, and how much do we see it as we look at the other planes as well? I've already talked about that. Again, step length and step frequency, where walking is about 100 to 130 steps per minute, running is about 175, 185. And this was mostly looking at tissues resonance for shock, and it seems it's about 3 hertz, which works out to be about 3 times 60 is about 180 hertz. So right down the middle, our tissue like that, our bodies like that, but more importantly, our neuromuscular coordination seems to be optimum at these stride frequencies and stride length values. As you can see there, there's a big long limb guy. He's hitting on his ankles, on his heel bone there. So another one I talked about earlier, the base of support. We want to have the feet that can be slightly out, but not too much. We don't want it too wide. Too wide, you'll get an ataxic gait. Too narrow, you get that crossover and put a lot of strain on the hips. The toe angle, out angle should be more than 7 degrees when walking, and it tends to decrease as speed increases. So you can have a slightly more toe out when walking, but when you go and video them and look at them running, you should see a little less toe angle. And then this is a very common one, and I've only really named the common ones here, medial collapse, or what we call Trendelenburg, or hip drop. You can see there on this slide that would be a left hip drop that's being caused by the glute med letting go, on the right glute med letting go, so that the left hip drops. It also can exacerbate excessive internal rotation, and you can also get an eccentric load just above the hip. That would be a pulling load above the hip. So you can have a glute pain on the right, and then you can have a muscle that's just superior to the left hip. That could be flared up due to an eccentric load from that constant every step, so that's 1,600 times or say 800 times every mile, you're getting an eccentric load. That adds up. So I think this point, if you've got some questions, I'm not sure how we're going to handle that, but thank you very much. I appreciate you viewing this and hope that this has been some help.
Sure. There's a couple of things I have. You've used some sports technology in your research here, video kinematics, and you're using then a bioharness device. And in that device, do you use the accelerometry for biofeedback during training at all?
Yes, we're just starting to use that now on our treadmills. In other words, we'll bring them in and we'll put them on the treadmill, and then we are able to pull up just the vertical window for the accelerometer and allow them to look at both the waveform, it's a sine wave, as well as a value. So let's say they're hitting 4 Gs, 4.1 Gs. We try them get to land softer to bring down that number to, say, 3.5 Gs. And we're having some initial success with that. We also teach them to go out and run without those devices and just listen to the sound they're making. And if they're making a loud sound, then they're probably hitting the ground hard. Another technique is using metronomes to control cadence. So we can have them go out and in the field or the treadmill and use metronomes to cue them for the correct frequency. And on the treadmill, they would maintain their speed while, say, increasing or decreasing their cadence. If you're doing it out on land, we would use a V-meter or a what you call an accelerometer or even an iPhone, where they would try to maintain their speed but increase their cadence. And that would force them to change their gait pattern.
My experience in working with runners is they don't really want to be strapped up half the time because they don't really want to know, because psychologically it impacts them sometimes. What's been your experience dealing with some athletes?
Well, I think you're right. I think even with top athletes, we were strapping these on basketball players for a while here, and they were a little bit leery because they thought it might affect their game, put them off their game, which is really no evidence to show that. I think once the athlete wears these devices and knows how to use the feedback effectively, and then more importantly after 6 to 12 weeks, begins to see it impacting their movement and impacting their injury rate or making them feel stronger or moving more fluent, I think they're more likely to wear these devices. Again, we can do a lot without strapping stuff on. They can just count their cadence and use a metronome. That can be just as effective sometimes in tidying up their gait. For sure, though, the technology is getting better and better and easier to use, and I envision the day when there'll be a transdermal patch where they'll get not just biomechanical data, but they'll get a lot of their other data they'll need, anything from respiration, heart rate, to lactate levels in their blood.
Yeah, I imagine that day will come very soon, the way everything's going at the rate that development is happening.
Right. The biggest thing slowing that down would be the coaches and the athletes' ability to trust and learn how to use new technologies.
Oh, I agree. Well, I want to thank you, David, for sharing this great information.
You're welcome. You're welcome. It's been a real pleasure.